The parking lots are empty now. The loading docks stand silent. 40 miles north of Chicago, a sprawling factory complex sits like a tomb. The place where 130 million Motorola Razr phones were born. In 2006, Motorola owned 22% of the global phone market. The Razr was the phone celebrities flashed on red carpets, the phone teenagers begged for, the phone that made you look successful. It sold 130 million units. Paris Hilton had one. David Beckham had one. You probably wanted one. 5 years later, Motorola was bleeding $4.3 billion in losses. Market share collapsed from 22% to 6%. Google bought the company for $12.5 billion, then dumped it for under $3 billion. The brand that invented the cell phone became a cautionary tale. What happened? Not bad luck. Not unforeseeable circumstances. A series of decisions that seemed perfectly rational at the time and destroyed everything. This is the story of how the most successful phone company of the 2000s made one fatal choice that turned their empire into a ghost town. And why that choice made perfect sense to everyone involved until it was too late to save them. To understand what happened to Motorola, you need to understand where it came from. Because the qualities that built the company were the exact same qualities that would eventually destroy it. Paul Galvin founded the company in 1928 in the depths of the Depression, in a small facility on West Harrison Street in Chicago. He was 43 years old, and this was his third attempt at building a business. The previous two had failed completely, one making battery eliminators, another in storage battery production. He was $750 in debt and working out of a rented space so small that his entire operation fit in a single room. What Galvin had was a specific kind of stubborn optimism. Not the blind faith of a dreamer, but the methodical persistence of a man who'd already failed twice and learned from it. He'd grown up poor in a Harvard, Illinois farming community, the son of Irish immigrants. His father had worked a 160-acre farm. Galvin had left school at 16 to work as a railroad laborer, then as a traveling salesman for a popcorn stand company. Everything he knew about business came from watching deals go bad and figuring out why. His big idea in 1928 was to build affordable car radios. The concept wasn't new, car radios existed, but they cost between $110 and $250, which was roughly a third of what an entire car cost at the time. They were luxury items for wealthy people. Galvin thought he could make them for everyone. The first product was called the Motorola, a combination of motor and ola, which was a popular suffix at the time suggesting sound, like Victrola. It sold for $30 when competitors were asking $110. The strategy was simple: undercut on price, deliver on quality, build volume. By 1930, even as the Depression deepened, Galvin Manufacturing Corporation was shipping units. Here's what's important about this origin story. Motorola built its entire identity on democratizing technology through engineering excellence and mass production. Not on inventing entirely new categories, but on taking existing innovations and making them accessible. That DNA, take what exists, engineer it better, make it cheaper, build it at scale, would define the company for the next 80 years. It would carry them to extraordinary heights, and it would be their undoing when the rules changed. By the early 1970s, Motorola was already a giant. They dominated car radios in the 1930s and 1940s, moved into television sets in the 1950s, and built a massive semiconductor business in the 1960s. Revenue in 1973 was approaching $1 billion. They employed tens of thousands of people across multiple continents. They were respected, profitable, and powerful. But they were also at risk of becoming just another industrial conglomerate, solid, respectable, boring. Robert Galvin, Paul's son, who'd taken over as CEO, understood this instinctively. He'd grown up in the business, watching his father navigate the Depression and World War II. He knew that companies that stopped innovating didn't gradually fade. They collapsed suddenly when the market moved. So, when a team of Motorola engineers led by Martin Cooper came to him in 1973 with a wild idea, a portable telephone that didn't need to be attached to a car, Galvin backed them completely. The technology was expensive, the market was unproven, and AT&T, with infinitely more resources, was working on the same concept through their car phone division. Most executives would have hedged their bets. Galvin gave Cooper's team everything they needed. On April 3, 1973, Cooper stood on a Manhattan street corner and made the first public cellular phone call on a device that weighed 2.5 pounds and cost $3,995 in 1973 dollars, about $27,000 in today's money. The battery lasted 20 minutes. To most people, it looked like an expensive novelty. Think about that for a second. Cooper was demonstrating a device that cost more than a used car, that you could only use for 20 minutes before it died, and that had exactly 0 cell towers to connect to anywhere in the United States. It should have been laughable. Instead, it was visionary. I think this is the moment where Motorola's cellular future really begins, even if nobody understood that yet. Because Cooper didn't just build a prototype to prove a technical concept, he built it to change how people thought about communication. The press coverage was massive. The image of Cooper holding that brick-sized phone became iconic. Motorola had staked their claim as the company that would lead the cellular revolution. It took another decade for the infrastructure to catch up. The first commercial cellular network in the United States launched in 1983. The first commercial Motorola phone, the Dynatac 8000X, weighed 2 pounds and cost $3,995. It was still absurdly expensive. But by then, Motorola had built such a lead in cellular technology that competitors were years behind. The numbers from the 1980s and early 1990s tell a story of complete dominance. By 1994, Motorola held 60% of the global mobile phone market. 60%. Their market capitalization exceeded $34 billion. The StarTAC, introduced in 1996, was the first truly portable flip phone. It weighed 3.1 ounces and fit in a shirt pocket. It was revolutionary. It sold in the tens of millions. Most companies would have stopped there, not Motorola. They kept pushing. By 2000, they'd spent over $30 billion on research and development. They'd built manufacturing facilities on 4 continents. They employed 150,000 people. They were one of the most admired companies in the world. But the market was changing in ways that would expose a fundamental weakness in Motorola's DNA. The late 1990s saw the rise of a competitor that operated from completely different principles. Nokia, based in Finland, took a different approach to mobile phones. Where Motorola was engineer-driven, build the best technology, price it competitively, manufacture at scale, Nokia was design-driven. They thought about phones as fashion accessories, not just communication tools. The Nokia 3210, launched in 1999, sold 160 million units. It came in multiple colors. It had customizable ringtones. It had simple games like Snake that became cultural phenomena. The phone itself was less technically advanced than comparable Motorola models, but it felt more personal, more playful, more human. Motorola's response was to double down on what they knew: engineering excellence. The StarTAC was brilliant technology, but it came in gray or black. It was serious, professional. The message was clear: this is a tool for getting things done. Which worked fine as long as mobile phones were primarily business tools. But by 2001, phones were going mainstream. Teenagers were getting them. Parents were getting them for safety. The market was shifting from early adopters who cared about technical specifications to mass consumers who cared about how the phone made them feel. By 2003, Nokia had taken the global market share lead. Motorola's share had dropped to 13%. The StarTAC's successor products, the V60, the V70, were well-engineered but uninspiring. The company was profitable, still massive, still respected. But they were losing the cultural conversation. Inside Motorola, there was growing recognition that they needed to do something dramatic. Not just another incremental improvement, but a product that would recapture the imagination the way the StarTAC had in 1996. Something that would prove Motorola could still lead, could still define what a mobile phone should be. The pressure to deliver that product was enormous. Revenue in the mobile devices division was flat. Market share was eroding quarter by quarter. The board wanted results. Shareholders wanted growth. The engineering teams knew they had the capability. They just needed the right product. What they came up with would exceed everyone's wildest expectations. And, paradoxically, that would become the beginning of the end. The Razr project began in 2003 as an exercise in proving what Motorola could do when they combined their engineering excellence with genuine design ambition. The lead designer was Chris Arnholt, working with engineer Roger Jellicoe. Their mandate was simple and impossible: create the thinnest phone in the world without compromising functionality. The challenge was that thin phones had terrible battery life, weak antennas, and keyboards that felt like toys. Physics was the enemy. Every millimeter you shaved off thickness cost you volume for components. The StarTAC had been thin for its time at 19 millimeters. Competitors were shipping phones at 20 to 25 millimeters. Motorola wanted to go under 14 millimeters. The engineering team spent 18 months solving problems that seemed unsolvable. They developed a new antenna design that was paper-thin but maintained signal strength. They created a keyboard using chemically etched metal that was both ultra-thin and tactile. They designed a custom battery that sacrificed some capacity but fit in an impossibly small space. They pioneered a hinge mechanism that was solid enough to last thousands of flips, but thin enough to meet their targets. The result was 13.9 millimeters thick. For context, that's thinner than a standard ballpoint pen. When closed, it felt more like a compact mirror than a phone. The materials were premium. Aircraft-grade aluminum, not plastic. The lines were clean and aggressive. It looked expensive because it was expensive to manufacture. Motorola priced it at $500 without a contract, roughly $800 in today's money. In 2004, when the Razr launched, most phones were free with a 2-year contract or cost maybe $200 at most. The Razr was priced like a luxury item, which is exactly what it became. The launch was handled like a fashion product, not a tech gadget. Motorola sent Razrs to celebrities before public release. They placed them in high-end boutiques, not just carrier stores. The first reviews weren't in tech magazines. They were in Vogue and GQ. The phone appeared on red carpets. It showed up in movies and TV shows. Paris Hilton was photographed with one. So was David Beckham. The symbolism was devastating to competitors. Here was Motorola, the engineering-focused incumbent, suddenly playing Nokia's game of design and culture and winning. The Razr became the phone that people wanted to be seen with. It was aspirational, desirable, cool. The sales numbers were extraordinary. In the first year, Motorola sold 4 million units. In the second year, 20 million. By the end of 2005, the Razr was the best-selling phone in the United States. Motorola's market share rebounded from 13% to 22%. Stock price soared from $10 per share in 2003 to over $24 in 2006. The mobile devices division swung from stagnation to explosive growth. Inside the Libertyville facility and other Motorola manufacturing centers, production ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They couldn't make Razrs fast enough. Carriers were placing orders 6 months in advance. The phrase Razr thin entered the cultural lexicon. When people said cell phone in 2005 and 2006, many of them pictured a Razr. By 2008, total Razr sales exceeded 130 million units. 130 million. The profits from the Razr single-handedly transformed Motorola's financial position. In 2006 alone, the mobile devices division generated $11.8 billion in revenue, with operating margins approaching 15%. The Razr wasn't just a hit product. It was a golden goose, laying eggs so fast the company could barely count them. Here's the thing about the Razr. Its greatest strength and its fatal flaw were exactly the same quality. It was so successful, so dominant, so profitable, that it became impossible for Motorola to think clearly about what came next. While Motorola was riding the Razr wave to record profits in 2006, something else was happening in the mobile industry that would change everything. But you had to be paying very close attention to notice it. In January 2007, Steve Jobs stood on a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. The initial reaction from industry executives was mixed. The phone had no physical keyboard. It cost $599. It only worked on AT&T's network. It didn't support third-party applications. It couldn't send MMS messages. From a feature checklist perspective, it was incomplete. Motorola's internal assessment was that the iPhone was interesting, but not a serious threat to the Razr franchise. The reasoning seemed sound. The Razr was available on all carriers, cost half as much, had a proven keyboard, and had the benefit of being a known quantity. The iPhone was an experiment by a computer company with no experience in the mobile phone market. What Motorola missed, what almost everyone missed initially, was that the iPhone wasn't competing on features. It was competing on paradigm. The question wasn't, does it have a keyboard? The question was, do you even need a keyboard if the screen is good enough? By mid-2007, the Razr was still selling well. Motorola shipped 26 million units in Q2 2007 alone. But the growth had plateaued. The problem was that Motorola had responded to the Razr's success by doing exactly what you'd expect. They made more Razrs. The Razr V3X, the Razr Va 3C, the Razr Va 3i, the Razr Va 3XX, the Razr 2V8, the Razr 2V9. They created a Razr in every color for every carrier, at every price point. The strategy was to maximize the Razr brand while it was hot, extract every dollar of profit, and extend the product cycle as long as possible. What's remarkable about this decision is that it seemed completely rational at the time, which is what makes it so instructive. You have a product generating billions in profit. Your shareholders want growth. Your carriers want Razr. Variants they can promote exclusively. Your manufacturing facilities are optimized for Razr production. Your suppliers are tooled up for Razr components. Your marketing materials all feature the Razr. Your brand identity has become synonymous with the Razr. The entire company had organized itself around feeding the Razr machine. To pivot away from that, to invest in something radically different, would mean cannibalizing your own sales, confusing your customers, and taking a short-term hit to profits. The incentive structure at every level of the organization pointed in the same direction. Make more Razrs, make them cheaper, sell more of them. Meanwhile, inside Motorola's R&D facilities, engineers were working on smartphone concepts. The company wasn't blind to the smartphone trend. They'd been making Windows mobile devices and Palm OS phones for years. In 2007, they were developing Android prototypes. They had the technical capability. But here's the brutal truth. They didn't have the organizational will to bet the company on smartphones while the Razr was still printing money. And by the time the Razr stopped printing money, it was too late. I think this is why this story still matters. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of how quickly the landscape can shift under your feet. In January 2007, Motorola was the #2 mobile phone manufacturer in the world with 21% market share. 12 months later, that share had dropped to 14%. 24 months later, it was under 10%. 36 months later, it was approaching 6%. The parallel with what happened to BlackBerry a few years later is hard to ignore. Different companies, different products, but the same fundamental dynamic, a company built around a specific form factor and input method, trapped by the success of that form factor, unable to make the leap to a new paradigm until the market had already moved. Motorola's smartphone efforts in 2007 to 2009 weren't non-existent. They were just catastrophically fragmented and under-resourced relative to the scale of the challenge. The company was simultaneously developing devices on Windows Mobile, experimenting with Linux-based platforms, creating custom proprietary systems, and beginning to explore Android. Each platform had separate engineering teams, separate roadmaps, separate carrier relationships. There was no unified vision of what a Motorola smartphone should be. The Q series, launched in 2006, was Motorola's answer to the BlackBerry. It had a QWERTY keyboard, ran Windows Mobile, and was targeted at business users. It sold decently, about 1 million units in the first year. But it was fundamentally a Me Too product in a category where BlackBerry was already dominant. It didn't change the conversation. The ROKR series tried to combine music and phones, partnering with Apple for iTunes integration. The ROKR E1, released in 2005, was supposed to be revolutionary, the first phone with iTunes. Instead, it was a disaster. It was limited to 100 songs, had sluggish performance, and was quickly overshadowed when Apple announced they'd just make their own phone instead. Each of these efforts consumed resources, engineering talent, and management attention. But none of them received the kind of company-wide commitment that the Razr had received. They were side bets, experiments, hedges. The real business was still selling Razrs and Razr variants. By Q4 2008, the magnitude of the problem was undeniable. Motorola's mobile devices division lost $1.2 billion that quarter. Market share had collapsed to 6.5%. The iPhone 3G, released in July 2008, had sold 6.9 million units in its first quarter. Android phones from HTC and Samsung were gaining traction. The Razr, meanwhile, had become obsolete almost overnight. Not because it stopped working, but because it represented an entire category that consumers were abandoning. The Libertyville facility, which had run 3 shifts a day at peak Razr production, began laying off workers. First in small numbers, a few hundred here and there, then in waves. By early 2009, employment at the facility was down to 1,200 from a peak of nearly 3,000. Production lines that had assembled millions of Razrs sat idle. The component suppliers who'd built entire businesses around Razr parts were scrambling to find other customers. Think about what that actually meant for the people who worked there. This wasn't just an employer, it was the center of gravity of an entire local economy. Families had bought homes, assuming steady Motorola employment. Small businesses had opened to serve Motorola workers. The company had been a pillar of the community for decades. The collapse wasn't just corporate, it was personal for thousands of people. What I find fascinating about this period is how obvious the warning signs look in retrospect, and how invisible they clearly were at the time. The data was all there. iPhone sales climbing, Razr sales declining, smartphone platforms proliferating, consumer behavior shifting from voice and text devices to mobile computers. But the weight of institutional momentum, the power of existing profit streams, and the natural human tendency to believe that what worked before will keep working. All of that conspired to delay the necessary response until it was too late. To Motorola's credit, they eventually did make a real bet on Android. The Motorola Droid, launched in October 2009 in partnership with Verizon, was the company's attempt to prove they could still compete in the smartphone era. The Droid was everything the Razr wasn't. Thick, heavy, running software developed by Google rather than Motorola, with a slide-out physical keyboard that felt like a compromise between old and new paradigms. But it had something the Razr never needed: a massive marketing campaign that positioned it as the alternative to the iPhone. Verizon spent over $100 million on the Droid Does campaign, directly attacking the iPhone's limitations. The ads were aggressive, masculine, almost military in tone. "I don't run simultaneous apps, Droid does." "I don't have interchangeable batteries, Droid does." The message was clear. If you're a serious person who needs a serious phone, Droid is for you. It worked, at least initially. The Droid sold 1 million units in its first 74 days. By the end of 2010, Motorola had sold over 5 million Droid units across various models. The mobile devices division swung back to profitability in Q1 2010 for the first time in years. Stock price, which had fallen to under $4 per share in early 2009, rebounded to over $8. For a brief moment, it looked like Motorola might pull off a comeback. The Droid brand had mindshare. Verizon was committed to the platform. Android was growing rapidly as an ecosystem. Motorola was one of the early leaders in Android adoption, with better carrier relationships than some of the newer entrants like HTC. But the moment didn't last. The fundamental problem was that Motorola was now competing in a software-driven world with a hardware company's DNA. The iPhone's advantage wasn't just the device, it was iOS, the App Store, the ecosystem. Android as a platform was compelling, but Motorola didn't control it. Google did, which meant that HTC, Samsung, LG, Sony Ericsson, and eventually dozens of other manufacturers could all make Android phones too. In the Razr era, Motorola's manufacturing efficiency and carrier relationships had been competitive moats. If you wanted a thin flip phone with premium materials, you bought a Razr, because only Motorola could make it at that quality and price point. But in the smartphone era, everyone was buying the same processors from Qualcomm, the same displays from Samsung and LG, the same operating system from Google. Differentiation became harder, margins compressed. Samsung, in particular, emerged as a devastating competitor. They had the advantage of making their own displays, which gave them cost advantages and access to the newest screen technology first. They spent aggressively on marketing, $4 billion on marketing in 2011 alone, more than Motorola's entire mobile division revenue that year. And they shipped phones at every price point, from flagship Galaxy S models to low-end devices for emerging markets. By 2011, Motorola's position was untenable. The Droid franchise was still selling, but Samsung had become the dominant Android manufacturer. Apple was capturing all the high-end profits. Chinese manufacturers were undercutting everyone on price in developing markets. Motorola was stuck in the middle, too expensive to compete on price, too undifferentiated to command a premium. The mobile devices division lost $4.3 billion between 2009 and 2011. Employment across all facilities dropped to under 20,000 from a peak of over 66,000 in the mobile division alone. The Libertyville facility was operating at a fraction of capacity, assembling phones that weren't generating profits, serving a market that had fundamentally transformed. In August 2011, Google announced they would acquire Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. The deal was positioned as Google's way of protecting Android by owning patents and having a hardware arm. Larry Page, Google's CEO at the time, said Motorola would operate independently and that Google would continue to be a fair partner to other Android manufacturers. Inside Motorola, there was cautious optimism. Google had resources. They understood software. They might be able to provide the kind of platform integration that Samsung couldn't match. Maybe this was the salvation Motorola needed. It wasn't. The fundamental mismatch was that Google was buying Motorola primarily for the patents. 17,000 of them accumulated over decades of mobile technology development. The actual business of making and selling phones was, at best, a secondary consideration. Google was a software and advertising company. Hardware manufacturing, supply chain management, carrier negotiations. These were not their core competencies. Under Google ownership, Motorola launched the Moto X in 2013. It was well-reviewed, with innovative features like touchless voice control and active display notifications. But it was priced at $579 unlocked, launching it into competition with the iPhone and Galaxy S4. It sold poorly. The Libertyville facility, which by this point was primarily focused on assembly and some R&D rather than full manufacturing, went through another round of restructuring. Employment dropped further. The sprawling complex that had once been the pride of Motorola's mobile division was increasingly becoming a relic of an earlier era. By January 2014, less than 2 years after the acquisition closed, Google announced they were selling Motorola Mobility to Lenovo for $2.91 billion. They kept the patents. Lenovo got the brand, the employees, the facilities, and the right to use the patents. The message was clear. The patents were worth $12.5 billion. The actual business of being Motorola was worth less than $3 billion and wasn't something Google wanted to be in. There are 4 core lessons in Motorola's story, each of which extends far beyond the mobile phone industry. First, innovation debt compounds. Motorola's problem wasn't that they stopped innovating entirely. They continued developing new products throughout the 2000s. But they underinvested in the right kind of innovation at the critical moment. While they were optimizing Razr variants in 2007 to 2008, Apple was building a software ecosystem. While they were hedging across multiple smartphone platforms, Google was focusing all their mobile efforts on making Android excellent. The specific example from Motorola's history is telling. In 2006, at the peak of Razr profits, the company actually reduced R&D spending as a percentage of revenue. They increased marketing spending to extend the Razr brand, increased manufacturing capacity to meet Razr demand, and increased shareholder returns through buybacks and dividends. All logical short-term decisions, all catastrophic in aggregate. What Samsung did differently. They took profits from their existing businesses, displays, semiconductors, appliances, and plowed them into mobile R&D even when they didn't have a hit product yet. Between 2007 and 2010, Samsung's mobile R&D spending increased by 40%, while Motorola's stayed flat or declined. By the time both companies were competing in the Android ecosystem, Samsung had 3 years of accumulated advantage in software, user experience, and manufacturing optimization. The universal lesson: innovation isn't just about what you do this quarter. It's about whether you're building capability that will matter in 3 years when the market shifts. Motorola optimized for the market as it was. Samsung invested in the market as it would become. Second, culture eats strategy. Motorola had smart people who understood the smartphone threat. They had engineers capable of building competitive devices. They had access to capital. What they didn't have was an organizational culture that could abandon a profitable business to chase an uncertain future. The company's entire identity was built on being the engineering-driven manufacturer that won through technical excellence and scale. That worked brilliantly when competitive advantage came from antenna design, manufacturing efficiency, and carrier relationships. It failed completely when competitive advantage shifted to software ecosystems, user experience design, and platform network effects. The specific example: in 2007, several senior engineers at Motorola advocated for going all in on Android before the first iPhone even launched. They'd seen Google's early prototypes and understood the potential, but the corporate immune system rejected the proposal. Android was unproven. The Razr was generating billions. Shareholders wouldn't tolerate sacrificing near-term profits for a long-term bet. The engineers were told to keep working on Razr variants and treat smartphones as a parallel effort. What Apple did differently: when the iPhone launched, it cannibalized iPod sales almost immediately. Apple could have split the difference, kept the iPod as the music device, made the iPhone focus on calls and email. Instead, they let the iPhone eat the iPod. The iPod division was integrated into iPhone. The company reorganized around mobile. The culture permitted self-cannibalization because the alternative was being cannibalized by someone else. The universal lesson: culture is what your organization actually does when faced with hard choices, not what your mission statement says you value. Motorola's culture valued protecting existing profits. Apple's culture valued owning the future even if it cost them present revenue. Third, platform dependency is a double-edged sword. In the Razr era, Motorola's close relationships with carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint were a massive advantage. Carriers co-marketed devices, subsidized prices, gave prominent retail placement. That system worked when carriers controlled distribution and consumers chose phones based on what was available in carrier stores. The iPhone changed the dynamic. Suddenly, consumers were choosing a phone first and a carrier second. People switched to AT&T specifically to get an iPhone when it was exclusive to that network. The power shifted from carriers to platform owners. Motorola's response to this shift was to double down on carrier relationships. The Droid was a Verizon exclusive. So was the Droid X, Droid 2, Droid 3. The strategy was to make Verizon so successful with Motorola products that they'd prioritize Motorola over other Android manufacturers. But that created a dependency. When Samsung offered Verizon better terms, more marketing dollars, and more diverse product lines, Verizon's loyalty evaporated. By 2012, Samsung was Verizon's preferred Android partner. Motorola had built their entire strategy on a relationship that turned out to be purely transactional. What worked? Apple's model of controlling the platform end-to-end meant they never depended on carrier preference. They had leverage because consumers demanded their product. Google's model of making Android free and open meant they didn't depend on any single manufacturer. They won if the platform won, regardless of who made the devices. The universal lesson: dependencies on partners are only sustainable if you are providing something they can't get elsewhere. Motorola provided carrier-specific Android variants. Samsung could do that too, with better terms. Apple provided an ecosystem consumers demanded. That's a dependency that works in your favor. Fourth, the cost of being second. In the Razr era, Motorola was a first mover in the thin phone category. That gave them 18 months of competitive advantage, millions of units of sales, and brand association so strong that Razr Thin became a cultural reference point. In the smartphone era, Motorola was a fast follower. The iPhone launched in June 2007. Motorola's first credible smartphone response was the Droid in October 2009. 28 months. In technology markets with network effects and platform dynamics, 28 months is an eternity. By the time the Droid launched, Apple had released 3 iPhone generations, built the App Store to 100,000 applications, sold over 30 million units, and established iOS as a mature platform. Android had launched on multiple devices from HTC. The market had moved, mindshare had been captured, and Motorola was competing not for first place, but for survival. Here's where it gets interesting. The Droid was arguably a better device than the original iPhone in several ways. It had better specs, more features, more carrier support. But it didn't matter. The iPhone had the ecosystem, the brand cachet, the developer support. The cost of being 28 months late was measured in billions of dollars of lost opportunity. What this shows: in platform markets, timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. You can have superior technology, better distribution, more resources, but if someone else gets to customers first, builds the ecosystem first, captures developer attention first, your technical advantages don't compensate for their installed base advantage. The universal lesson: the time to make bold moves is when you're strong, not when you're desperate. Motorola had the resources to go all in on smartphones in 2007 when the Razr was still profitable. Instead, they waited until 2009 when they were hemorrhaging money and had no choice. By then, the window had closed. Drive past the Libertyville facility today, and you'll see a much quieter version of what once was. Lenovo still operates some R&D and limited production there, but employment is a fraction of the peak years. The parking lots that once overflowed now have empty sections cordoned off. The loading docks that once worked around the clock to ship Razrs by the truckload stand mostly silent. The Motorola brand still exists, but as a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Lenovo bought the mobile division from Google in 2014 for $2.91 billion, less than a quarter of what Google had paid just 3 years earlier. The brand occasionally releases phones that get positive reviews and sell modestly. The Razr name has been revived for foldable phones that are technically impressive but commercially marginal. In 2023, Motorola held roughly 3% of the global smartphone market. The brand that once controlled 22%, that invented the cell phone, that created one of the most successful consumer electronics products of the 2000s, is now a minor player selling mid-range Android devices primarily in Latin America and parts of Asia. The legacy of the Razr itself is complicated. 130 million units sold. An entire generation of consumers who remember the satisfaction of flipping open that machined aluminum clamshell, the precision of the hinge, the thinness that seemed impossible when you first held it. It was, by any objective measure, a triumph of design and engineering. But it was also a trap. The success was so complete, so consuming, that it made clear thinking about the future nearly impossible. Every incentive pointed toward maximizing Razr profits. Every organizational structure reinforced Razr production. Every success metric validated the Razr strategy. Until suddenly, none of it mattered anymore because the market had moved to a different paradigm entirely. The parallel to other industries is stark. Kodak invented the digital camera, then spent 15 years optimizing film production while digital ate their business. Blockbuster had more stores, better locations, and more customer relationships than Netflix, but Netflix had the right platform for the future. Nokia dominated mobile phones for years, then missed the smartphone transition just as completely as Motorola did. What I find most striking about Motorola's story isn't the fall itself. Companies rise and fall, that's capitalism. It's how rational every step of the decline looked at the time. Motorola didn't make obviously stupid decisions. They didn't hire incompetent people or ignore their customers or stop innovating entirely. They made reasonable, defensible choices that seemed to optimize for success given the information they had. That's what makes this story so instructive. It's easy to avoid catastrophic failures that stem from obvious incompetence. It's much harder to avoid failures that stem from doing what seems right in the moment but turns out to be catastrophic when the landscape shifts. The buildings in Libertyville still stand. Some of the equipment that assembled millions of Razrs is still there, though much of it has been sold or repurposed. The people who worked those production lines have largely moved on to other manufacturing jobs if they could find them, to different industries, to retirement in some cases. The market didn't remember to honor what Motorola built. It simply moved on to the next thing, the way markets always do. The companies that survived the smartphone transition weren't necessarily better in any absolute sense. They were better adapted to the specific conditions of that moment. They were willing to cannibalize their own products. They invested in platforms rather than just devices. They moved faster when the ground started shifting. This is what makes business history so brutal and so fascinating. There's no loyalty to past achievement, no credit for what you built before, no grace period while you figure out the new rules. The game changes, and you either change with it immediately or you become a case study. Motorola's story isn't about failure to innovate. It's about the deadly gap between innovation and transformation. They continued innovating new products, new features, new designs, but they couldn't transform their business model, their organizational structure, their strategic focus fast enough to survive the platform shift. In the end, the Razr facility became a ghost town, not because Motorola stopped trying, but because they were trying to win yesterday's war. The troops were ready, the weapons were excellent, the tactics were proven. The only problem was the battle had moved to different terrain entirely, and by the time they redeployed, the war was already over. That's the lesson. Not that success breeds complacency, though it can. Not that big companies can't innovate, though it's hard. The lesson is simpler and more terrifying. In technology markets, what got you to dominance will not keep you there. The skills that make you successful can become liabilities when the rules change. And the rules always, eventually, change. The Libertyville facility stands as a monument to that truth. 40 miles north of Chicago, visible from Milwaukee Avenue, a reminder that nothing, no matter how dominant, how profitable, how seemingly permanent, is immune to the basic reality that markets reward adaptation, not achievement. What you built yesterday matters less than what you're building for tomorrow. And if you're still building for yesterday, you're already on your way to becoming history.